Hello. Today I want to react to the what is known so far as the attempted coup attempt in Benin against the government of President Patrice Talon, and then also speak on the wider uh, increase in coups and military takeovers in Africa, and what implications and what is driving these um, military takeovers and application for Africa. So there's no need to dwell too much on the Benin one. So we've seen the coup attempt. We don't know if it's a coup attempt, if it's how that's going to pan out. But it looks like a group of soldiers have took over the major TV station and have announced suspension of the constitution and all kind of stuff that you see when military take over in Africa.
Suspendu jusqu'à nouvel ordre. Les frontières terrestres, maritimes, aériennes du Bénin sont fermées jusqu'à nouvel ordre. La prise du pouvoir en ce moment traduit la ferme volonté du comité militaire de la refondation à mettre fin à l'exclusion de toutes les couches sociales de notre pays, sans distinction aucune. Dans la suite de la transition et de restaurer la cohésion nationale.
Now we've seen the rise of military takeovers. We've seen recently in Guinea-Bissau was the latest one. We saw in Madagascar. We saw in Gabon. Of course, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where we have the alliance of the Sahel states by those three countries. There was some sort of speculated coup attempt in Nigeria. So what is leading to this rise in coups military? So first we talk about the geopolitical factors. So in the many African states, gained independence in the 60s, late 50s, coming to 60s, and shortly after independence, the military took over. But the military never fought the fight of independence. The elite fought, and independence in Africa, you understand, is not even one. It's not even, but it's not one that was fought vigorously. It was one that came at the back of the Second World War, and how the Western powers, or the former colonial powers, looking at how they were embarrassed in that fight, and also looking at, and then begin to see the demand for independence. So, and then people really say that independence, people like Frantz Fanon and many people consider independence that Africa got as one, because it wasn't got under blood and toil, and it was just given. It was just like fine to some extent. It is. And then fast forward to the Cold War that ensued between between the United States and the former Soviet Union for over 50 years after the Second World War, and that ended in the breaking or dissolution of the Soviet Union in 89, coming up to 91. But between these periods, there were massive across Africa. You see, Africa was largely, many African countries were largely under military rule, and these militaries were tolerated by external forces. There's always been external forces involved in the politics in Africa. But then again, there's in the clamor for independence, which is the second independence. With that clamor for this independence, internally by activists demanding for, and then also what was happening geopolitically, externally, the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and all of that also had an impact. And the support for for authoritarian rule, military in Africa dissipated among external supporters who were otherwise supporting these military rulers and ignoring the human rights abuse and all of that at a point in time. So the combination of those internal clamor and demand for change and the external led to what you call the third wave of democratization in the 90s, where you see a sweep of elections in Africa. But these elections were CDO elections. They start saying from the Benin now to Togo to Nigeria, to all of those places. You started saying elections and the military couldn't sustain themselves in power. But some of these military rulers are telling us quickly converted to democracy. They continued to that. either the stooges or whatever continued in power. Some of these authoritarian governments converted and just transformed themselves overnight to Democrats. So, but Africa has never experienced true change, true transformation. So let's fast forward to what's going on in the last 10 years or within the last 10, within a decade. We begin to see the rise of, you saw in Sudan, we saw the People's Revolution. Again, let's first talk about the Arab Spring at the second half of the millennium, from 2010, 11, 12 of the Arab Spring, where population in the Arab Spring contesting against their leaders, and from Egypt to Tunisia to Syria, to all these places. But that didn't yield much. Come now to Africa now. What we're seeing, we see people's revolution, we see people revolting. We saw in Madagascar, and the demographic of this were the youth who are far removed from the anti-colonial narratives, and they're clamoring for change, clamoring for jobs. Africa has a massive teeming population, the youngest population in the world, and this population don't have access to good living conditions, to work, to job. And we see a lot of crisis going on in Africa, a lot of conflicts in Sudan. We saw the People's Revolution in 2019 that brought down the government of Omar Bashar. We saw across the Sahel, we saw the people, we see the anti-French narrative, that French sentiments that have now brought down so many governments in the Sahel. We saw in Gabon, we saw in the species, people are simply just tired of the status quo. And they're rightly so, because democracy, like I said, that was introduced with pseudo-democracy, adoption of liberal democracy, multi-party elections, and see constitutional, you see manipulation of the constitution, constitutional engineering. That's even in Benin. We see where recently there's been a constitutional change where they're extending the presidency from a single 5-year term to 7 years, and which we saw it in Togo as well recently, where we've seen a many of this, even in Nigeria at a point in time. During the Obasanjo era, Obasanjo was trying to go for the third term. So the problem in Africa is people coming into power and want to stay in power or grip. We saw the elections that happened in Cameroon, where Paul Biya has been in power since 1982, I believe, for nearly 50 years now, and Paul Biya is nearly 100. And when the election, you see the people protested, and you see how the security forces clamped down heavily on that. We saw in Ivory Coast where Ouattara, whoever is one election, Ouattara is nearly 90 and being there for 4 terms. We see in Rwanda where Paul Kagame has been in power now since 90s, since of the genocide that happened there, and kept on to power and in power. We've seen in Botswana where the parties have lost. The Botswana party has lost. We see in Tanzania, we see what's going on in Tanzania, protests against the female president there, and how the elections are deemed unfair. So regardless, with democracy in Africa is troubled. Democracy doesn't represent what a true democracy, democracy. So people are rights to contest, right to protest, but the danger now is this protest, the frustration of the people, the frustration of the youth are being hijacked by the military. The military is no savior in Africa. The military has never been a savior in Africa. And again, I think the military is abusing his opportunity, his privilege of being trained and having access to weapons to hijack these revolutions. The military have no business in there. I think Africa needs to redefine and its adoption of liberal democracy. Africa needs to redefine its system. Africa needs to look within the people. There should be the people's parliament. There should be a true democracy how it was, but Africa needs to look inwards, go back and look inwards and find a way to define how it wants to be ruled, because the way people out there, the leadership in Africa, the elites in Africa are self-serving. The elites in Africa, the elites in Africa, including the military elites, the civilian elites, because the elites are just lining up their pockets and in collaboration with their external partners. So But it's not that kind of revolution that Africa needs. Africa doesn't. The protest is a right of every citizen to protest, but I think Africa needs to be, the youth needs to move beyond protest and form a very structured, systematic system of challenging the status quo and finding a way of taking ownership of his revolution, not allowing the military to come and take over. We saw what happened in Madagascar. You know, the youth were just protesting against lack of electricity, and then the military is taking up. What's the military good? But the military has sustained the government in power, so the military cannot be the savior. So the youth in Africa, we saw in Kenya, the youth in Africa need to be self-organized. There's no revolutionary elite, but they need to form a new elite. We need to form new elites, new leaders. Africa needs new leaders that's gonna take over and serve the purpose for the people. New leaders that are going to be visionary leaders that are going to promote the interests of the people. That's what Africa needs. Africa doesn't need this. I see some people are celebrating this spate of military renegade. Now, history has taught us that nothing good is going to come up from it. So I think we need to be careful how we celebrate this recent military coup or this juntas. They find a way to extend. We've seen it. We saw it in Sudan. Now the transition process, it keeps extending it. In Burkina Faso, we've seen it. They were never going to do election. The situations don't change. It worsens. So it is a shame. Africa is so blessed with resources, human resources, natural resources, mineral. But the African people have been shortchanged, have suffered enough. So I think it's time that every African people sit down and take charge of our destiny, take charge of the destiny. That the way to do it is to form the People's Parliament. The way to deserve the red democracy, the way to do it is to go look inwards and find a way. The institutions that the African Union have not been very effective. They are ECOWAS, all of these, because they've turned a blind eye to some of these democratic flaws, like illegal manipulation, engineering, re-engineering of the constitutions, or when you come to elections that are not fair, and then you turn a blind eye, and then the military comes in and all this stuff. So we should be tough. So we really need to reform these institutions so that they will serve the purpose they need to serve. But let me leave it at that and say, I wish Africa well. I wish we can come to a place where we can take our destiny in our hands, and not in a violent way, but in a very systematic and strategic way to promote Africa's prosperity, development, and growth. A peaceful Africa, a prosperous Africa is what we need. All right, enjoy.